Hi, this is Eric Pistowski. Welcome to another EP on EP show. I'm thrilled today to have three good friends and also leaders in our field here to discuss sort of an interesting, different topic. So on my far left is David Steinhaus, who's now the VP and General Manager of Heart Failure for Medtronic. In the middle is my close friend, and we worked together for years, Richard Fogel, who is now the Chief Clinical Officer for St. Vincent of Indiana and formerly wonderful electrophysiologist in the lab with me. And right next to me is another close friend for years, Richard Page, who is currently the head of medicine at University of Wisconsin. So welcome all three of you to this unusual three of us together, because I'm going to take you on a topic that's totally different than much of what people get interviewed on. And that is really your divergence in your careers to a different thing. So I'm going to start, if you'll indulge me, with a very brief part of a famous Robert Frost poem, The Road Not Taken. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. So, David, we'll work down the line. You ran this really successful practice. You were involved in, if I remember correctly, writing the test for the NASB exam, and suddenly you weren't. Tell us why. What happened?
Well, I loved being a doctor. I wouldn't trade that for anything, and I loved working with the docs that I worked with in Kansas City. I've been doing it for 20 years, and I just had this sort of feeling, two things. One is been there, done that. I was excited by it, I enjoyed it, but I sort of felt like what was going to be the next challenge that I had. And the second was I realized that if I went to industry, which is in some ways more complex, I could have a bigger footprint. I could have more impact on people, because a doctor, you do it one at a time, and in this, if you get it right, maybe you can do it thousands or tens of thousands.
So did you have, before I ask the other two, did you have an inkling that you were going to leave the bedside, but industry was the place, or did a special opportunity come about that sort of made that pathway for you?
Yeah, it just came up. I mean, I remember Steve Molly, who used to run the business at Medtronic, came to me during an HRS session and said, would you be interested in being the medical director up here? And I said, no. And he said, well, maybe I'll come down and spend a day with you and we'll talk about it. And anyway, and he came down and he was charming, and so I decided.
So timing and opportunity.
Yes, you bet.
All right. Rich, you trained with me. You became not only a close friend of mine, but also a fabulous electrophysiologist. I loved when we did ablations together in the lab. And suddenly you weren't there. Suddenly you were climbing the local administrative ladder, and now we ran our group for a while, and now you're even up higher. What was the turning point for you?
So, a couple things. I still practice in the office, even though I'm not in the lab. I like solving problems. I like being around really smart people. I like new challenges. And I had a couple opportunities early on in my career to really kind of do different administrative things. And as I did them, I just kept getting asked to do more and more and different things. There was one thing where we started a new heart hospital. And that was really my first foray into administration and leadership. And then I just developed this natural skill set for leadership, just took one step after another. I still, I try to walk in both worlds. I still try to wear the clinical hat because I still practice, but I also like the administrative world, because in the administrative world, you can affect policy and you can affect, instead of one patient at a time, hundreds, thousands of patients at a time.
And so you're enjoying that new lifestyle?
I've always enjoyed working my brain. I've always enjoyed,
problem solving.
Problem solving. Yeah. That's what I am. I mean, it really is what drew me to EP as opposed to anything, because it's a problem. You sit down, you think about it, you solve it.
And before we get into a general discussion, we go to Rick. So Rick, you trained with me during my Duke days. Yep. And then you go down to Southwestern, you write a key paper on the use of defibrillators on airplanes, American Airlines, if I remember right. And I'm thinking, wow, this guy's going to be headed up this research thing. And next thing I know, you're off to Seattle and you're running cardiology, which starts to take you a little bit out of the fray. And next thing I know, you're at University of Wisconsin being a head of medicine. Now, you have something I don't. You have an administrative gene that I lack. You can actually put up with a lot more nonsense than I can, but why that transition? You were doing so well in your track and you suddenly, boom.
Well, it's interesting because, as you know, I saw John Gallagher and Will Seeley do an operation on Wolff Parkinson White, and thankfully I wanted to be like John Gallagher and not like the surgeon, because a few years later catheter-based ablation was happening, and that was a dream come true. And I went down to work with you to learn electrophysiology. My goal in life was an academic career as a cardiac electrophysiologist. After about a decade at UT Southwestern, I found that I was deriving as much or more satisfaction out of the lab as in the lab. That building programs and mentoring and still being involved in the teaching, research, and clinical care in a fairly well-balanced way was what I loved. But I found that I was enjoying the parts out of the lab, and frankly found I might have even been better at kind of running things than electrophysiology, and certainly was ready for a change. And as you've heard from all three of us now, ready to make a bigger or a difference. And then the opportunity in Seattle came up, running cardiology there. And after 7 years, really loving it there and working with wonderful people, I felt like it was kind of I was ready to take on another challenge. And at that point, becoming a chair of medicine made sense, and I've loved it for the last 8 years.
So all of you, though, have, and I think this is important for younger folks out there listening, you all had a floor before you jumped. So let me just open up general discussion. In other words, some people start out a couple years, they get a little frustrated. It sounds like for all three of you, you really made a career before you made a second career. Thoughts on that? Like, what would you suggest to people who are saying, oh, wow, maybe I should go into industry? So David, should they get a firmer foundation before they even look to there, or do you think it doesn't matter?
Oh, I think it does matter. I think people do need a foundation in medicine, and being a doctor is really an important thing. I think if you're going to go to medical school, you should go to medical school to be a doctor. You shouldn't go to medical school to then want to go into industry, because there's so many other ways you can get into industry if you want to do that right away. So I think if you want to take care of patients and you want to be a doctor, and then decide what you want to do as your second career.
And so I'm guessing the fact that you have that behind you gives you a special ethos when you visit with other EPs?
Oh, it's hugely important.
Yeah,
I mean, I kind of get it, and I think a lot of people don't.
Yeah, and I want to follow that theme, because I think people maybe listening in, some younger folks might think, hey, that's really cool, I'm going to do it right away. But I know, Rich, you and I have had so many discussions, and one of the things you've always said, and I know you're still seeing patients, you felt that to be vital to your ability to connect right with all your partners?
Oh, absolutely. I think fundamentally I consider myself a doctor, not just a guy with an MD. And I think that's just basically who I am, and that's my roots. I think if you want to be really, there's street cred. So if you never practiced, if you never touched a patient, if you never listened to a patient, if you never had to give good news or bad news, you don't have that credibility. It allows you to look through the eyes of the other physicians you're talking to. And if you can't look through their eyes, you really don't know where they're at. And it's really hard to lead them if you don't know where they're at.
I think it's a really good point. You've often said that to me. If I stop practicing, even though you've cut back your practice, if I stop practicing, I lose the ability to say, yeah, I understand your pain.
You lose credit.
Right? You lose credit when you start to talk to other doctors. I think that's true.
Now, I'm not saying that you can never stop practicing, but I think you have to have a core of practice and a core of practice experience so that you can really know where the docs are and what they're, how docs think is really important.
Yeah, and so you're also at an administrative level as a head of medicine. My guess is you're still seeing patients, though?
I still see patients in clinic. I agree completely with the idea of establishing a floor. And in an academic route, if you haven't published, if you haven't been active in academics, you're not going to be promoted to become a full professor, potentially have tenure, and then be even eligible for the sort of academic leadership jobs. I think it's critically important to still be a doctor. I see patients in clinic. It was actually, the other thing I'll mention is, I think it's valuable along the way, even though you're establishing the baseline competencies, to consider whether you should get some technical training in leadership. I took a certificate in medical management that included quality, strategic planning, finance, and leadership and change management, each one of them a one-quarter course. It was tremendously valuable. And I must say, actually, it was soon after my quality course that I had to fire myself from doing procedures because I wasn't doing enough to stay as good as even my own patients deserved.
Right.
So at that point, it was a transition, and that was a hard one. I don't know about you guys, but to no longer be allowed to have a sharp object in your hand it's tough to deal with. On the other hand, you've got to be able to accept that and find satisfaction doing other things.
So with that, I was going to ask all three of you, it's not like you're at the end of your careers, but any regrets? Do you ever sit back sometimes on one of those long plane rides and say, gosh, maybe I should have, I mean, I'm just curious. I mean, not that you're all very successful in what you're doing, but do you ever have any regrets?
Sure. I mean, I loved being a doctor, and I do miss it terribly, and I miss the procedures a lot. But you sort of have to decide you're graduating onto something interesting, or as interesting as it can be at the moment. And I think there's lots of room for doing all sorts of different things in your career.
I think that's wonderful. I'm sort of the old guy at the table, even though none of us are spring chickens anymore. But I have a different gene, and maybe it's because of mom and dad. I mean, they practiced well into their 70s. I just, my Achilles heel is I don't think I could ever leave the bedside. And I don't think that's much of an Achilles heel, but it's prevented me from doing other things. And I don't think that's bad necessarily, but I look at the three of you and I say, what ifs? You know, I have a different kind of view. I say with the what ifs, you know, but I think you're all saying the same thing, that you settle into what's comfortable for you and you can do something different and still be really good at it. You don't have to be on the same track that you started on, right? And I think the key is diversity too.
And changing it up every once in a while.
Yeah.
If you think of, the people who might be listening to us now, you have 4-year aliquots when you go through high school, college, med school, residency, fellowship, and then suddenly you have a career, 30 years. And I've seen some people just continue to gain mastery in clinical care. And some of the rest of us, after a decade or so, say, this is great.
What else is there?
But what else might I do?
Next
What's
challenge.
the next challenge?
Where's the next challenge?
I think most of us, and I think that includes people who have long clinical careers, are lifetime learners. I think that's the big deal. Some new challenges, new learning, keeps you happy.
We're always asking questions. I also think it's really important to have passion in what you do. So, I don't think I could be an administrative leader if I didn't have passion about it, if I didn't care about it, if I didn't care about quality and process improvement, making the world better. I think you heard that from all of us. We wanted to make a bigger impact. And we've gone a little bit different ways, all of us, but we've all kind of taken the same route.
Yeah, well, no, that's the reason why I gathered the three of you together for this show today, because I'm sure that there are younger folks out in the field, and I know they are, because I do a lot of fellow work, young attendings. And they're always worried about RVUs and their lives, and I try to tell them, just settle down, But I also do tell them that if it gets to a point, after they've put their years in, that they don't like it anymore, I mention you all at times, not always by name, that there are alternative routes that can bring you as much or more satisfaction, and that you shouldn't feel locked in, right? So three of you have a gene I don't have. So I guess we need a few genes like mine, but you're all highly successful. I congratulate you, and thank you so much for joining me today in this show. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Eric.
Gentlemen, and David. Not that you're a gentleman, by any means.